In this video, we'll learn how to declare variables in JavaScript using let, const, and var keyword. We'll also explore JavaScript's dynamic typing and understand why const should be your default choice. Alright, in JavaScript, variables must be declared before they can be used, which is somewhat consistent with languages like Java and C++, but the difference is that we don't really specify a type. Instead, we use a variable declaration keyword. So let's take a look at the example for this. Here is an example code. Now allow me to increase the font size a bit here. Okay, so here we declare a variable called first name using let, then assign it a value and use it. We can also declare and initialize it in one line. So let's do that as well. Let's run both of these codes and see the output. So here you can see the output of the first name is printed. Here the last name is printed. You also see that the console log type of last name prints out a string. So type of is an operator to check what type a variable holds. Right now it's a string. Now one of the other things about JavaScript is the way it converts between different types. So JavaScript has two features when it comes to using types. One is dynamic typing, which you just saw. So you don't really declare, well, you don't really specify what a type of a variable is. The program figures it out from the value that you store in that variable. Now what happens is that JavaScript is also weakly typed, which means that if I go here and change that last name now to something entirely different, well, like a number 2, you run the code again, you can see that it allowed me to store a value of a completely different type into this variable. So this is a feature that is often referred to as weakly typed. Now let's talk about how these kind of things can cause problems, because if you mix types together, then JavaScript is start coercing one type into another, and things can get a little out of hand when this happens. So let's take a look at an example of this. So here, if we run this snippet of code, you'll see that when we use plus with a string and a number, JavaScript converts the number to a string and concatenates them. So that's why a string 5 plus number 2 ends up being a string 52. And in the other example with minus, it converts the string to a number and subtracts. So a string 5 minus number 2 ends up being number 3. The last example is true plus 1, where true is being coerced to a number and it ends up being 1, and then 1 plus 1 is going to end up being number 2. So generally speaking, you should avoid writing code like this. You should never use this as, let's say, a feature in the programming language. You should explicitly convert different types if that is what you intend, and have proper error checking for it. And you also need to be on watch for these sort of things happening unintentionally, especially when you build web application. When you let user input something in forms on web pages, by default, what you receive from them is always going to be a string. And sometimes you may forget that it is a string. You may just assume, for example, it's a number, and you start operating on it, and unexpected thing will happen if you do that. Okay, so we've shown you examples of using let. So let is a block scope variable, which is to say that if you try to use it before it is declared, it's going to throw an error. If you try to redeclare it, it's going to throw an error. And it is a scope to a block that it is defined in. And when you come out of that block, you can redeclare it again. So these are all typical expectation that one would have from a variable, especially if you're coming from programming languages like Java. Let's see an example of this. So here what I've got is I'm declaring a variable num, assigning it value 2, and then I'm reassigning that value again, and I'm printing it out. So this works. If I go and, for example, take this console log and put it at the top, and try to run it again, then I'm going to get a reference error because it says you need to declare it before you use it. So let's put that back in here again, run it again, it works correctly. If I also try to redefine it, like say let num, and this time write it as, give it a new value, and run it again, it also gives me like a syntax error and says redeclaration of let num. So that's not acceptable. You can't do that. Okay, so let us move on and see another keyword that you can use when it comes to declaring variables. So this one is const, and you use const when you want to define constants. So it has some similarities to let. For example, it's blocker scoped. However, you have to initialize it, and you cannot reassign a value to it again. So let's take a look at an example, and then we'll play with this example to see how it works. So basically, to start with, let's say I say const name, and I give it my name, and then I print it out, right? And so it all works. Now, something we did with num is that we reassigned a different value to it. Like if you go and try to do that, like if you try to go and say name is John, and run this code, it's going to give you a type error, and it's going to say that, hey, you're not allowed to do this with constants. If you change const to let, then this is going to be okay, and it's going to work. So const will prevent you from making a change like this, which could be helpful, especially if you want to declare and define a value and make sure that its value doesn't change throughout the program. The other thing about it is that if you declare it and then go and initialize it, it's not going to be happy about it. So again, it's going to complain. If you do this with let, it's going to be fine, but with const, it's not going to allow you to do that. So those are some of the features of how constants work. Let's take a look at something else that the students often make a mistake about it. So there are some variables in JavaScript that are reference types. And these variables, even though if you declare them with const, you wouldn't be able to reassign that variable to point to another object. However, you can update that object itself. A very good example of it is an array. So let me explain this to you with an array, okay? Now let's take a look at how this works here. You can see that I'm declaring an array of numbers, and you might look at this and think that, oh, okay, so this array is constant because I declared it with const. It means that I'm not going to be able to modify this array in any shape or form. And that's not correct. You can add values to it. You can remove value from it. You can update any of the values in there. For example, here I'm updating the element at index 2, which is the third element. So if we run this, you can see that we got 1, 2, 4 instead of 7 and 9. And so this is okay. It's perfectly fine. What is not okay is that if you change numbers, right, and have it point to, let's say, a different array, or point to a different object or a different value, if you try to do that, then it's going to complain about it because you declared it with const, right? So the variable itself points to something, which in this case is an array, and you're not allowed to have it point to another object or another array. So this is a violation, right? But you can update the things about that object, which in the case of an array would be like the values in it. So that works fine. Okay, now let's go and talk about something else. In addition to having const and let to declare variables, there was another older way of declaring variables in JavaScript, and that's through using a keyword called var. And this is generally considered an outdated way of doing things, and the recommendation is to not use it. Imagine it does not exist, but you may see some old code and see that the practice is there because you're looking at legacy code, but there are some unexpected behaviors that would that let and const were created later on to prevent and fix. So I'm just going to give you one example for it. So it's something like var x, and I'm giving it a value 1, and then I'm redefining it. Var x again, I'm giving it a value 2, and this code just works. And that's not a good thing, right? This is like I have redeclared a variable, and I could have given this like a totally different data type too. And sorry, there you go. So you can basically go down in your code and completely redeclare a variable, and it's not going to complain at all, and it will create hard to debug programs. You can also like try to bring the console log up in here and display it before you actually declare it, and notice that it doesn't give you an error. It's not telling you that you're gonna have to first declare it to use it. It tells you that the value of it is undefined. This is something we're gonna look at a little bit more later, but notice that if I had something like let, and let me just comment this out, and if I try to run this, then I'll get an error. The program throws an error. It's not going to let me like run my code. But if you change this to var, the code runs. There's no problem. It's just the value of x is undefined. All right, so these are to say that don't use var and just stick to let and const. Most of the things that you work with in JavaScript are objects, the reference type, and on that point, it means when somebody looks at your code, most of the declarations that you have should be const. We typically use const more than we use let. Okay, so we have learned today how to declare variables in JavaScript using let and const. Remember to not use var and to prefer const over let. We're going to be looking at different data types in JavaScript in the next lesson.